Welcome back to another episode of Fantastic Descriptions, a YouTube channel dedicated to the fine art of narrative storytelling and description as it takes place in your role playing game. I'm your host, Neil Aiken, and I'm an author of 2 books of poetry. I'm also a creative writing coach with a multi genre MFA and a PhD in literature and creative writing. So I've studied a lot about writing, both from a critical and from a practical craft oriented sense. And I take great delight in going through and thinking about how we can apply what we've learned from the art of creative writing and storytelling to the task of being a great game master, and how do we become better at describing things. So last episode we looked at what we can do to prepare for improvising descriptions, and this episode we're going to zero in on part of that preparation, looking specifically at preparing descriptions of sight, descriptions of visual elements, and the type of things that we might include in our palette or our sort of descriptive prep sheet, if we want to call it that, that would make it easier for us to improvise those descriptions. So last time we looked at an overview of all the different components to improvised description, thinking about them in terms of sights, sounds, smells, movements, and the first thing that characters notice when they step into the room. Today's discussion, as I mentioned, will focus specifically on sights and how do we prepare a palette or maybe a descriptive cheat sheet for describing visual components of a scene. We're going to focus on 2 different approaches, which are by no means the only approaches to coming up with, I would say, categories or boxes in which we might place different types of descriptive elements. Um, I, Going back to the palette idea, you might just think of it as like 7 different zones, 7 different types of color that you might add to a scene. So let's call these colors, well, we're not going to call them colors, but they operate like colors. So this one arrangement that I've thought up might focus on these 7 elements: terrain features, common and unusual, light sources, reflections and shadows, corpses and carnage, debris and objects, signs of life and evidence of recent actions, inhabitants and creatures, openings and escapes. And the idea is that these are different, like color. If you were dipping into your palette, you might choose to color a scene with 1 or 2 of these elements, and that would help brighten it up or help sharpen it up in a way that would make it more than just sort of a bland, generic description of an empty room or of an open plain or a part of the forest that's simply dark and deep, right? So, terrain features. These would be either man-made or natural components. So you could talk about pits or pillars. You could talk about, a natural rise or a hill or a cliff, or something else that might come to mind. Or it might have to do with the type of natural foliage that's in the area and vegetation. Who knows? Light sources, reflections and shadows, fairly self-explanatory, but basically think about, like, is there a source of light in the scene? What happens in terms of reflective surfaces? It could be like is there an icy surface that reflects light and kind of suggests, a danger there? Or does something cast a long shadow? Things like that. Or is there a part of the room that's really difficult to see into because of shadow? These type of things draw people's attention, and we'll focus them there. Corpses and carnage, self-explanatory. If you're going to describe a room in which there is a body, people are going to be drawn to the body, right? So it's amazing, in terms of interior design for dungeons, what adding the right corpse to a situation will do, right? That makes me think that there's a whole horrible HGTV market that's being missed in terms of dungeon design and dungeon decor. But who knows? Maybe there'll be some sort of home dungeon reno show that shows up somewhere. Um, Debris and objects, and that's simply, where we have corpses and carnage, aftermath of battles. You would have debris and objects, just sort of the aftermath of some sort of destruction or decay. And so that's more of that sort of vein. Signs of life and evidence of recent action. So whereas debris and objects might be the aftermath of some sort of encounter or destruction, or decay, signs of life could be more recent happenings. So like if the party's been chasing someone through the streets and that fugitive breaks through an abandoned building and starts knocking over stuff, the signs of life we're talking about would be the evidence of that person's passage, broken windows, a knocked over chair, things like that. Or if you're in natural terrain, could be bent grass and broken branches, could be a trail of some sort. Or maybe we run into the consequence of something else that the party had engaged in earlier. Perhaps they set free a goblin, and only to discover much later on that it has been captured and tortured, and so there's a consequence to their actions. Maybe it was viewed as a traitor by its own people. Who knows? Inhabitants and creatures, and that's simply to say, like, in addition to combat encounters, you can also think about more mundane, simple encounters. Maybe there's an anthill and there's lots of ants in this area, or maybe there is an annoying screech owl. It's not meant to be like a major epic encounter. It's meant to be some suggestion, a little bit of flavor for the scene. Openings and escapes. I think, and maybe this is just watching too many gangster or mobster movies, but I think a lot of people do pay attention to descriptions where there is a clear sign of exit or entrance that the party members might engage with, they might interact with. Let's take a practical example. Let's say at some point that your party is going to venture off towards a swamp. You may not have fleshed out the specific encounters that have happened there or will happen there. You may not have a maze or a particular challenge set in mind. But what you could do is build a set of, build a number of palettes that might be useful should they veer off in that direction, so that you would have something to describe. Certain things about the swamp. So we'll build here first a feature palette. That is to say, a palette that has objects or items that would be seen in the terrain of the swamp. And so, for instance, under terrain features, we might make a list of things that we might encounter: mud, stagnant water, and maybe include a couple things like a skull-shaped boulder. Um, could be cool, right? So you might brainstorm, add a few other things, but terrain features. Next, we would take like the light, shadows, and reflection section and think about, what could we include here? Well, it's a swamp. There's probably some sort of ghostly light thing floating around. Maybe there are really deep shadows in some of the waters or sections of the swamp. And in terms of reflection, perhaps water. But maybe, and I might make a longer note here, that water could reflect something eerie. Maybe it shows a ghost behind you or something like that. So I'd make a couple notes about that. When looking at corpses and carnage, I think about the swamp and I might think, oh, there's probably a dead horse. And no doubt there'll be flies circling around and perhaps even a dead merchant. In terms of debris and objects, now that I've been thinking about a dead horse and a merchant, I get the idea, oh, probably there's a burnt out wagon and maybe some smashed barrels. An iron key perhaps rests around the neck of the dead merchant. So I could have some of these type of things. They don't all have to be on the merchant. Maybe they're scattered throughout the swamp. Maybe the iron key belongs to someone completely differently or is just unknown. But these are things that pop into mind as I'm building this association of different features or elements that might be in the swamp. Thinking about signs of life or evidence, I might think, if passing through a swamp, there'll probably be some bent branches. Maybe someone has painted something in red. And if there's something moving in the water, no doubt it will leave ripples. And so thinking about describing the swamp surface, I could include some of these details. Under inhabitants and creatures, I might include I might think, most likely it's swamp. There'll probably be some sort of alligator. Perhaps there'll be sturges. Maybe there'll be a merchant's bodyguard who's still alive, and we could have a conversation with them. The party might encounter a merchant's bodyguard first. And so it doesn't really matter the order. These are all kind of coexisting in the same little world. And finally, under openings and escapes, I might brainstorm a few different ideas. Probably there's some sort of stone path through, maybe there's a secret or an ancient stone path through the swamp that people who know what they're doing know which one to take, which stones to hop on. Perhaps there's rotting boards, a little bit less safe way to cross the swamp. And in terms of other openings, undoubtedly there's some sort of river mouth that opens up into the swamp. So again, some more ideas about where to go in terms of a feature palette. Now, you can build a different type of palette. You might say, I'm fairly comfortable coming up with things that are in the swamp, but I don't know if I might run out of ideas for adjectives. And so you could build an adjective palette, and you might think, in terms of describing terrain features, what are the words, the adjectives that come to mind? Muddy, low-lying, shallow, deep, dangerous. You might have a longer list. Lights, shadows, reflections. Undoubtedly, there's something ghostly, eerie, dark, gloomy. Perhaps that's the type of swamp I want to build. Corpses and carnage. When I think about corpses, probably they're maggot laden. That's a great descriptor. You encounter a maggot laden body, half buried in the swampy marsh. You find something rotten, blood splatter. These are descriptors that kind of, again, add to kind of a dark feel to what the swamp would be like. A lot of decay, a lot of rot. We're starting to border on smell, but that's okay. These things get tied together. Debris and objects. So what kind of descriptors would I use for talking about things found in the swamp? Well, we kind of already established in the feature palette, this idea of like some sort of merchant that's been ambushed or fallen on bad times, ends up dead in the swamp, and his stuff is smashed and scattered, trash, broken, tossed. So we could do something like that. We might focus instead on things that are rusty, that are, things that are slimy. We might focus on those type of descriptions. We might focus on burnt things. All these things are valid. Signs of life and evidence. Again, most of this, I'm under the impression if we're talking about a swamp, there's probably evidence of people moving through or failing to move through, right? So bent, trodden down, mud field. That sounds like things like I might use to describe things. Passages of creatures and people through the swamp. I might say things like, that there's signs of an ill-fated effort, right? Maybe I want to emphasize how most people fail to cross the swamp. Inhabitants and creatures. Here, the adjectives might be lurking, enormous, shadowy, and powerful. I might want to present, some sense of there's a mystery, an ominous feeling to things. Things are lurking or hidden. We don't understand exactly what they are yet, but they make their presence known in these ways. Or, something that's moving through the water might be powerful or enormous. You can combine these together. You can come up with your own adjectives, but this is just, again, swamp adjective palette, thinking about what might go on mine when building an encounter or a setting like this. Openings and escapes. How would I describe, the different passages or portals or ways in and out of the swamp? I'd probably say unsafe, treacherous, partially covered, concealed. I might say, that maybe waterlogged or swampy or swamp. Who knows? Whatever, marshy, swampy, those type of things. And again, I feel like even though we're talking sight and visual things, you may find yourself leaning on words that come out of sound or come out of smell. A third approach is to think about your palette as really a set of pre-written uh, descriptions of things that you would like to include. So 7 things that you might encounter in the swamp. And you don't necessarily have to use all of them, but they're present there. They're available to grab at if there's a moment in which you feel like the description is lagging, or like the players seem a little bored about this particular part of the swamp. You might look over your list and say, and in the center you see an enormous banyan tree, its roots spreading throughout the murky swamp. Or you might call upon like a ghostly green light flickering between the dark trees. Or you might point out the bloated corpse of a man lying washed up in the reeds. Or you can note the smashed crates and barrels that litter the stone path. Or that someone has scrawled, "Krug lives," on the side of a boulder. Or that there's a kobold carrying an enormous backpack that stumbles into view. Um, or that there's a small wooden door at the foot of the great banyan tree. All these things, I've kind of spun out of the idea of the swamp. I've thought about the other descriptions we've put together, and come up with some individual specific things that might be fun for the party to encounter. I haven't said what's on the body of the man washed up in the reeds or who he is. And the party may ask some questions. I might have to make some ability checks or skill checks. And as they do so, I might come up with an idea of who this person is. Um, Likewise, where, is the ghostly green light going somewhere? Does it attempt to lead them somewhere? Or is it just flickering in and out and disappearing? Who is Krug? Why do we care that Krug lives? Is this some sort of religious zealot? Is it an announcement of a conspiracy that Krug did not die, as was rumored, but he lives? Who knows? The kobold that emerges in view with this enormous backpack, is he a merchant? Is he sole survivor of his tribe, taking all their possessions with him? Is he a thief, and with a big score? Who knows? And it's up to the players and to you to figure out where this goes. But you could have some initial ideas and then let things unfold. And this is part of the improvisational part, is like you've given them a clue, an invitation to imagine, and then you let them run with it. Where does the small wooden door go? Who lives there? We don't know. Maybe you have something in mind, maybe you don't. That's okay. That's okay. So here's 7 things as a palette. So what's our takeaway? Well, I would say visual description tips that I would give would be to think about like a general structure that works is to focus on adjective, noun, action, or context. So a tall tree leans over the edge of the path or over the edge of the cliff, whatever. We have some sort of a description of a noun or an object that could be important to the scene. And then we have some relation to the path or to something that they might care about. There's a lot of things we can do. You can look back over the other examples I've given. They're all kind of in this same vein. Keep your descriptions short, focused, and evocative. You're improvising. You no need to spin this gigantic yarn. And like I said, oftentimes give them the initial clue, some sort of suggestion. And it's just like a prompt for writing or for improv. They will take it wherever they will. Then you will respond, but it's an exchange back and forth. And collaboratively, you will arrive at some sort of interesting encounter. That doesn't necessarily need to be a combat encounter. When you give details, provide them in the order as if you were following that character's line of sight. And so sometimes you're collectively thinking about the party and what they see, and sometimes the single character that looks out and can see something. But move in a fashion that makes sense for how people actually see. And I would say there's 2 key things to think about. If you are in a situation where line of sight is very limited, where like field of view is very limited, so like you're inside of a dungeon or an interior space, when you open the door, what is immediately apparent is often in the center immediately before you in the center of your field of view. And then you are able to perceive things outside of that. So you move outward from the center. But if you're, let's say, in a large open space, a panoramic view of things, you're looking really across a horizontal length, horizon, basically, and you will scan it. And so describing what they see when they look out from, let's say, a tower, or they're wandering through the wilderness, and they kind of pan the entire view, you're going to move across in a horizontal fashion. And so think left to right or right to left, and describe things in the order that they're going to notice them, um, as if you're just following the camera across. Where possible, provide a hint or a clue as to what types of interactions might be possible. And that's not necessarily to say that you have to always lead them or push them to do certain things, but if you are going to pause to give some sort of description, there should be some sort of hint as to what you could do. So, like if you tell them that there is a lever, they will want to pull it or leave it alone, right? But you've given them a lever to think about. Levers suggest that there's some sort of mechanical contraption behind that. What is it going to do? If you have them walk into the middle of some sort of a ritual, then the party has a choice to interrupt the ritual or to leave it and let it happen. And I think giving them sort of the opportunity to encounter something visual, think about what they want to do, and then react or not react. In other cases, you might give them a sense of historical or antiquity, something that's a historical nature or something that feels ancient. And that will suggest to them that there might be an opportunity to use their history check. If there's a strange, unidentifiable creature moving through the swamp, and you see a trail behind with obvious prints, then someone's going to want to make a nature check or a survival check to figure out what's going on, and let them. So it's good to provide like little hooks for people to interact with. Finally, and this is kind of a general category thing, I would say it's always nice to leave a little bit of mystery, a little bit of the unknown, and just let players speculate and create their own explanation. I find frequently if I'm ad-libbing or improving a description, I might throw something odd or weird in there, and I don't know why I did it. But the players will think there's something important about it. And maybe they'll interact with it. Maybe they'll suggest something. Maybe they'll speculate that it has some connection with something else that happened much earlier. And they will start to form a narrative. And the narrative that they spin might be more interesting and compelling than whatever I had in mind. And so that then creates an opportunity for me to riff off of what they have provided, and they feel like they're really smart because they figured something out. And I'm just really taking what they've offered me and running it a step further. So if there's a theme that is evolving or pattern that they're starting to see, embrace it, add to it, but leave a little bit of mystery to it as well. And I would say these are like really simple things that you can, well, I don't know if they're always simple, but here's some really critical things that you can use to improve your visual description, in addition to thinking about how do I build or prepare these type of description palettes, whether you're looking at creating something that is feature-based and object-based, or something that's based on adjectives, or you're thinking about 7 things that can be found in the space. These type of description palettes will free you up, because having done the work in advance, when you are pressed in the moment to actually spin in a description on the fly, you're going to be able to lean back on that preparation or glance over your notes. And I would say have no more than an index card or half a sheet next to you. It doesn't have to be exhaustive. It just has to be like just enough to give you some inspiration in the moment that you feel confident about because you were the one that came up with it. And I think that's critical, that rather than having these pre-generated or purchased lists and tables that someone else has compiled, which you're not familiar with, if you own it, if you've created it, if it came out of your own imagination, you're going to be able to find it easy to integrate that into your narrative, into your descriptions. And that will give you a confidence that your players will appreciate. They will feel like, wow, this world feels alive, and it feels like you knew what you were doing. And they don't need to know that you did a little bit of prep work and you spun the rest of it based on these type of palettes, these type of cheat sheets that you created, that don't require you to read word for word everything, but instead simply offer you an opportunity to imagine and to riff off of a few short words or a few short lines. So that's about it for this particular episode of Fantastic Descriptions. I hope that this discussion of visual description and thinking about what we can do to build different types of descriptive palettes is helpful for you. And if it is, please let me know in the comments. If you like what you hear, please share it on social media. This is a small channel. Every little bit of assistance helps in terms of spreading the word. I take time out of my schedule to create these videos, and I do appreciate it when I hear back from people about what kind of impact it's had on them, or if it resonates with them as something that they've already been doing. And so, yeah, I would love to hear more from you. And if you have ideas or suggestions for future videos, or ideas and advice you would give other people about doing visual description, feel free to share it. And I'd love to hear it. And perhaps I'll even integrate it into another video. So until next time, all the best to you and your games, and to you and your players. May the dice always be good to you, and may the words always flow. And until next time, that's me, Neil. This is Fantastic Descriptions, and we'll be back again, hopefully in the near future, with another video, probably on sound or smell. We'll see. Until then, take care and goodbye.